Welcome to Shield Maidens, Women of the Norse World, the podcast that celebrates the remarkable women of the Viking Age. From fierce warriors and powerful queens to wise seers and cunning goddesses, these women left an indelible mark on history. Join authors Johanna Wittenberg and K.S. Barton each month as we explore the stories, achievements, and impact of Norse women. Hello, and welcome to Shield Maidens, Women of the Norse World. This is episode 4, Supernatural Women from Norse Mythology. I'm K.S. Barton, the author of the Norse Family series, a Viking saga of love, revenge, and sacrifice. And with me is Johanna Wittenberg. Hi, Johanna.
Hello, how are you doing, Kim?
I'm great.
Good. Well, I'm Johanna Wittenberg, author of the Norse Women's series, based on the life of a Norse queen who ruled alone for 18 years at the dawn of the Viking Age.
I know I've mentioned this before, but I just love it that she ruled for 18 years.
Alone, no less.
Alone. It gets me every time you say that.
It's really something.
It really is. For anybody to rule alone for 18 years in that time period. Well,
and then they don't see another word about her.
Yeah, well, of course not. As we've been discussing, these women tend to get written out of the history and the poems and everything.
And it's our job to bring them back.
That's right. That's why we're here. Well, in this episode, we're going to discuss supernatural women from Norse mythology. And maybe among them are some our listeners maybe have never even heard of before. So, but the most well-known of the Norse supernatural women is the goddess Freyja. And we've talked about her before. She's a Vanir goddess who mostly is associated with love, but she also chooses half of the warriors who fall in battle for her own hall. They don't all get to go to Valhalla. And she's also most likely the leader of the Valkyries, who we discussed in episode 3, Shield Maidens in Norse mythology. And there are more poems and stories that feature Freyja than any other goddess. By far, most of the others just have a brief, this is who she is, and that's about it. Or she's so-and-so's wife, and that's it. Freyja has quite a bit more.
Yes, she does.
So there are many different types of supernatural women in the Viking world.
Yeah, there's several different names that are sometimes used interchangeably, and we don't know whether that's because it was because of a translation error, or simply because the divisions between supernatural women were not that rigid. In verbal tradition, every storyteller puts their own interpretation on the story, and the versions that were written down centuries later have been retold and revised many times over the years. Aside from the Valkyries, who we've all heard of, perhaps the most well-known supernatural women are the Nornir. Kim, can you tell us about them?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Nornir are the Norse goddesses of fate. They determine the fate and the lifespan of every human child in the world. In fact, they are known to preside over childbirth or maybe over a baby's cradle when they're first born and determine their fate. We mentioned in a previous episode the hero Helgi, and the Nornir had visited him and said he was going to be a great king and one of the greatest of all men. So there are 3 Nornir. There's Skuld, and her name means what should happen or what will happen. And Verdande is what is happening, and Urd, what has happened. So we have past, present, and future represented. And they meet at the well of Urd, and this is located at the base of the world tree Yggdrasil. So Yggdrasil is a giant ash tree that holds all the 9 worlds of Norse mythology. And I've seen a lot of different interpretations of this. Some are, like the different worlds are on different branches, and it's all kind of unclear how exactly that works. Because in a lot of the stories, even with the gods, they walk from world to world. Now, Odin and Loki have walked from world to world. And so it's not really clear how these worlds live within the world tree. But that's for artists to figure out. And the fact that and I had never thought of this before I was thinking about this episode, that because they meet down by the well, it made me think of other water spirits in other mythologies. And I'd never made that association before. And that made me think of the naiads in Greek mythology. And also there were 3 types of naiads. So we have that 3.
Yes, it's a magical number.
It is a very magical number. We will come across it today in a couple of places. And in the Norse poem Fafnismal, in the Poetic Edda, which is a poem about the hero Sigurd the Dragon Slayer. So after Sigurd gives the dragon his killing blow, they have a long conversation. Having a long conversation while you're dying is a very common trope in the Norse stories. It's kind of funny. And this one is no exception. I mean, it goes on for several pages, I think, many stanzas when Fafnir is asking Sigurd who he is, who his father is. At first, Sigurd won't tell him what his name is or who his father's name is because he knows that'll give the dragon power over him. Anyway, eventually he does admit who he is because of his ego. His pride makes him tell this dragon, like, no, I'm the son of a king. So he does ask Fafnir some questions since he's a dragon and he's been around for a while. And the Nornir are included in this list of things he asks the dragon. And Fafnir says that they are not all from the same family, the Nornir. He says that some are born from the gods, others are elves, and some are born from the dwarves. So that makes it a little unclear who or what they are.
And then I've read somewhere that they're also Jotun, maybe.
Yes. Yeah, I think I've seen that too. And then, so that got me thinking, if they are born from different races of supernatural beings, why are they depicted as only 3?
Good question.
Were there more of them at some point, or did they somehow, the 3 that we know of are somehow like the symbolic of all these others? So there are some Norns who are about the past and future, and they're just all represented as this one being. I don't know. It's one of those questions that can't be answered, but it just really got me thinking, well, if he's saying that they are born from all these different races of supernatural beings, then why are there only 3? And what does that mean? Was there a story somewhere where there were a bunch of them? Or were they influenced by Greek mythology? Oh, as an aside, J.R.R. Tolkien was inspired by this conversation between Fafnir and Sigurd when he wrote the scene in The Hobbit where the dragon Smaug and Bilbo talk to each other.
Oh, interesting.
Smaug realizes that Bilbo is there and they have a conversation. He even does the same thing where the dragon asks Bilbo who he is, what his name is. Bilbo won't tell him. He says he lives under the hill. Finally, the dragon figures out who he is. But yeah, it's very similar. It's a long conversation between the two of them. There was even a little conversation where they were talking about the dwarves, and Fafnir told Sigurd that he couldn't trust the dwarf he was with, Regan. And then in Tolkien, Smaug told him he shouldn't trust the dwarves who he had traveled with to the mountain.
Interesting.
Yes, that is one of the very many influences from Norse mythology that Tolkien drew from.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I love those connections. And back to the Nornir. So they, as I mentioned, they were similar to the Fates in Greek mythology. And the Fates in Greek mythology were Clotho, who was the spinner who spun the thread of life, Lachesis, and her name means like the allotter, like she allots the amount of thread, she measures it, and Atropos, the inflexible, and she cannot be turned away or she can't be changed, her mind can't be changed, and she's the one who cuts the thread.
Aha.
Yes. So they were associated with weaving implements like thread, the spindle, and the staff. That spinning and weaving is very common. And then there's also a triple goddess in Celtic mythology. It's the Morrigan, Bave, and Macha. And the Morrigan is the one that most people are familiar with. And she's a goddess of fate as well as battle and war. To me, she's similar to the Norse Valkyries, because she can help men achieve victory. She chooses who will live and die in battle. And she even shows herself to warriors sometimes right before they're going to die. In fact, there are plenty of stories where she appears maybe at a river or some kind of place with water, and she's washing blood-stained clothes. And if a warrior sees her before battle, that's it. Then your fate is to die. So you don't want to see the Morgan washing bloody clothes. And
Absolutely
then
not.
Babe, her name means crow. And the Morgan is associated with crows as well. And she's a war goddess and a goddess of death. And Babe can bring about a fighting frenzy among men. And Matcha is the odd one out. She's a fertility goddess as well as a war goddess. But her name is not associated with crows or anything like that. Her name means like a plain of land, which I'm still trying to kind of figure out where that all fits in. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, my thought is that it's the plain of a battle or a battlefield is what she represents.
Okay. And then why is she a fertility goddess as well? She's often depicted pregnant.
I think it's life and rebirth, death and rebirth. The Celtic and Irish myths are very old and they don't always make sense.
Well, yeah,
sure.
That's true. I guess all of mythology is like that.
Yeah.
Doesn't make sense.
Very much.
But actually that I can see that. So the Morgan, she might show up before a battle to warn, or not to warn, but to let the warrior know this is it. And then Babe is the one who's maybe in amongst the battle, driving them to their battle frenzies. And then Matcha is like
and they're all one,
right,
in many ways. So they're the three different aspects of life, kind of like the Nornir and the Greek fates,
right? And then in the Celtic mythology, they also have the maiden mother and crone,
right?
That three aspects of a woman's life.
Yeah, I think there's bits and pieces of all of these myths and stories that are missing.
Yeah.
And that's why so often they don't make sense, because they've been told and retold over and over, and different versions have come to light. And when I know with the Celtic, the Irish monks were the ones who wrote these down. So they were very old by that point. And that was the Celtic monks, the Irish monks were around in the 500 and 600 AD time period. So they were pretty close still to these stories, but they go back 2,000 years or more.
Yeah. Well, plus I think the people of that time period probably had a very different way of looking at the world. It was much more magical. There was a lot more that was unknown and frightening.
Absolutely.
And so I think that plays a part. We live in this world that's everybody's connected, and we're often cut off from nature and the seasons. It doesn't matter what time it gets dark. I can turn on my lights.
Right.
It doesn't matter if it's the middle of winter and the day doesn't last very long. I can turn on the lights. I can turn on my heat. So I don't have to rely on whatever crops my family is raising. I don't have to make my own clothes. I don't have to do all those things. And there has to be such a different
It's huge. It's hugely
way
different.
of looking at the world that we just can't even fathom.
Yes.
And you, Johanna, you mentioned in a previous episode that the triple goddesses, like the Norns, were the inspiration for the witches in Shakespeare's play Macbeth.
Yes.
And weren't there also three, I just now thought of that, three wise women in the story of Perseus, where they had the one eye that they had to share? I think there were three of them too. Anyway. And then, of course, the Nornir are similar to the three fairies in Sleeping Beauty, in that they preside over babies when they're born and give them their fate. Yes. So there are so many similarities and overlaps and inspirations from these old stories in our culture today. But fate wasn't the only supernatural phenomenon the Vikings believed in, right, Johanna?
That's right. There were others. But I want to tell you about one more story about the Nornir, which I recently ran across. And this is in Norna Guest's Tale. It's in the Flatty Yearbook, and it was written in around 1300. So it looks like it may have been a spin-off on some other tales that were Greek. But the Nornir were believed to aid in childbirth, and they were believed to be present at birth, as we were talking about earlier. And they may protect or curse the child. So in this Norna Guest's Tale, three women who are called the Nornir arrive at the gathering for the birth, and they're supposed to come and bless the newborn son. So the youngest, whose name is Skuld, wants to give the boy a short life. And the way she does that is she curses him by saying he will only live as long as the candle that's flaming next to his cradle. Well, Urd, the eldest Norn, takes the candle, puts it out immediately before the curse can take effect, and gives it to Guest's mother. She hides it until he comes of age, and then she gives it to him when he becomes a man, and he carries it with him all his life. And he lives for 300 years and he starts out with Sigurd the Dragon Slayer and lives through that, through Ragnar Lothbrok's life, through Harold Finehair. And finally, he meets Olaf Tryggvason and he becomes Christian. And when he becomes Christian, he lights the candle. And when the candle goes out, he dies. Well, that was a very interesting thing. But in some tales, these women are called the Disir, not the Nornir. And that brings me into these different types of supernatural women. And their names are so often used in place for each other. But I'm going to talk about the Disir as a distinct kind of person from the Norns. But to talk about them, I need to talk about the Viking soul. So the Vikings believed that a person had 4 different aspects to their personality. And the first 2 are the hammer, which is literally your skin, your shape, your body, and the hugr, which is your mind or your spirit. And a person who could travel astrally is said to have hamrammer, which means shape strong. The ability to, the ability to leave the body and enter an animal was called hamlepa, which is body leaping. And when Odin sends out his 2 ravens, Hugin and Munin, they are, which means mind and memory, their names mean mind and memory. He sends them out to fly around the world and bring back news. That's an example of hamlepa.
Can I mention something about
Sure.
Odin? What I love about this is when he sends out Hugin and Munin, I think it's in Grimnismal that he tells the boy that he worries about them. He fears for them when they're out, but he fears for memory most.
Yes.
Which to me, it just, there's something about that I love. Maybe it's because they were, they didn't really have a writing system. So that if you lose your memory, maybe these poets, as they were saying this, like the thought of losing your memory would be so much more frightening. I don't know what the difference is between the two, but I just find it so interesting that Odin was more afraid of he feared more for memory than the other,
which is,
but that he feared for both
thought.
of them. Yeah, but he feared for them, which means do if they die, does something happen to him?
Well, and that's something that we will get into in the next, not this episode, but the next episode. We'll be talking about that. So that's a very good point.
Oh.
And I also wonder, now that you bring this up, it didn't occur to me before, but I wonder if it also has to do with old age.
Yeah, I think so
and
too.
Fearing the loss of your mind and your memory. Mm-hmm. Anyway, those are very, very interesting points. And when we get into the next episode, we'll be talking about human sorceresses. And we will talk about what happens if something happens to you when you're out of your body. So the adept could leap into the body of any animal, but people also had a fylgja, or follower. That's another part of the soul. It's a totem animal that was their lifelong guardian, but they didn't see their own fylgja usually. If you saw your fylgja, it could mean that your death was imminent. It was taken as that. Your fylgja was maybe there to help you cross into the other world. There's also stories of fylgja, and they use the same word, and these were human female ancestors. And these guardian women are also known as the Disir, or the Dis. The Disir watch over family members, and they bestow or personify hamingja, which is the 4th aspect of a person's soul. It's their luck. It's also their special powers. And somehow this hamingja can be passed along in families, but it can even be loaned out to others.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, there's a story about Harold Fairhair where one of his men asks him to lend him his hamingja.
Oh, I love that.
Isn't that?
I love that idea of how much they believed in luck. That
Yes.
luck was just such a huge thing. That was what made warriors follow certain kings or jarls or chieftains or whoever, because they thought they had good luck. And if their luck ran out, then people would leave them. It was such a huge thing. And that luck could rub off. Yeah, really
Yep.
neat.
The Fylgja or the Disir, who are kind of interchangeable when they're talking about the women, and the Hamingja, which goes with them, or their luck. It can be passed down in the family, but these entities exist independently of the person. They can reject an individual. So your luck can leave you. Your Hamingja can desert you. They can go to another, or they can just reject you if they don't like you for some reason.
Can you feel, do they feel that?
Pardon?
Could they feel that? Like, would you know if your Fylgja left you?
I think, I don't know. I can't think of an example of it, but I think it's where they come to them in a dream.
Okay. Yeah. That makes sense. Dreams
Sometimes
are very
you
important.
wouldn't know until it started to happen. That's a good question, because I haven't got a specific example, but I know there are some. We could find out the answer to that question. So, and if someone's considered unworthy, then their luck or their Hamingja could desert them. So in the Halfredar saga, the Dis of a family followed the poet Halfred's ship over the sea. This is a woman walking on water after his ship. And she appeared to him just before he died. And he asked if she would please go to his son and guard his son. There's another in the Viga Glum saga. After the death of Glum's grandfather, who lived in Norway, Glum, who lived in Iceland, dreamed that this huge woman approached his house. She was higher than the mountains, and he invited her to stay and called her his Hamingja. So there you have, him using the word Hamingja as the name, an alternate name for a Dis or a Fylgja, follower. So the Disir can aid their kin in battle. In Volsunga saga, Sigmund's Disir do aid him. Also in Helga Vida Hundingsbana, the spirits of Sveva and Sigrun ride horses over a battlefield to aid Helgi. And later they protect his ship in a storm. In the Greenlandic Lay of Atli, Gunnar's wife dreams that dead women arrive and they invite Gunnar to their benches. And she wakes up and tells her husband his Disir were powerless to help him. And he does die in that. After that, the Disir, as I said before, can often be translated as Nornir. And I was just reading that in many cases, they are using those two words interchangeably, which kind of goes back to what you were saying about were there many different Norns. And my thought is that those words could be applied to humans as well as to supernatural beings.
So like women who could foretell a person's future, they would be considered a Norn or
someone with magical abilities. I don't know that. It's just a theory. The Disir were honored with sacrifices. And in some cases, these sacrifices were usually held at the beginning of winter nights, which is when they're preparing for winter. It's long before the solstice, where they're slaughtering animals. They have a big feast. Sometimes they have a market. And in Sweden, the disting, or the assembly of the Dis, is still held in February. It's also referred to as the charming of the plow. So this isn't winter nights. This is later in the year. So it's actually, just before they're starting to plant and before everything's starting to wake up. Some families actually had a temple devoted to the worship of the Disir. It was called the Disarsal, so the Hall of the Dis. And Njal Saga tells of Thorgerd and Irpa. They are the Disir of the Jarls of Ladir in Norway. And they had life-size statues in a shrine of these two female goddesses. And they were worshipped there. So when Jarl Håkon fought the Jomsvikings, he made offerings to Thorgerd and Irpa. and they appeared in battle with arrows flying out of their fingertips.
Ooh, like Force lightning in Star Wars.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So this was definitely a belief. It was a thing. And the Valkyries are called Odin's Disir. And Freya is called Vanadis, or the Dis of the Vanir. So we don't know, the word Dis we think translates to goddess, but it seems to be an ancestral goddess in many ways, just like the Alpha or the elves were oftentimes a male ancestor, and they were honored in the same way with sacrifices and feasts, the same way as the Disir. So they almost seem like they're counterparts, the male and the female, the elves and the Disir. So that's very, very interesting to me.
It reminds me of the Romans, how the Romans had household gods too, or, gods for a certain area, and they would have little statues of them, and they would make sacrifices and worship these particular household gods.
Well, so back to Freya. She was called Vanadis, and she was the mistress of Seith, of cider is another way of pronouncing it. And she taught that practice to Odin. In the poem,
should we define what that is? What kind of magic cider is? Yeah,
we could. It's a trance magic. It's a special kind of magic. It's kind of mysterious, but it's in which a sorceress goes into a trance and she contacts the spirits. The spirits will speak to her. They'll give her knowledge of the future. They'll tell her secrets. It's also very dangerous. She's out of her body. Other women have to be around her singing the Vardloker, which is a song or a chant that protects her. It calls the spirits to protect her. So that's what cider is.
And it's women's magic.
It's women's magic. Yes. Odin knows how to do it, and men did do it, but it was considered unmanly and disgraceful for men to do it. And we don't exactly know why. There's theories that it was a sexual kind of magic, but we don't have any real examples of it. So I think we can look into that a little bit more when we go into the human sorceresses next time, because we'll talk about some of the grave findings, and they give us clues as to what this magic really was.
Yeah. Well, Loki even calls out Odin for his unmanly practice of Seidr. Is that in Lokasenna?
It is.
Lokasenna should be titled Loki Behaving Badly. Because whenever he's being mean like that, or insulting people, it's usually from that poem.
Yes. Exactly. And but it reveals a lot about those gods and goddesses that he is insulting, maybe not in the most favorable light, but it tells us some things about them. There was in the poem Voluspa, which you're going to talk about more in a minute, there was a mysterious woman named Gulvig, which means gold lover or gold lust. And she appears in Odin's hall way back at the very beginning. And the Aesir were afraid of her, and they pierced her with spears, and then they burned her, but she came back to life. She came back to life 3 times. And the poem goes on to say that when she came to the houses, they called her Heid, which means bright one. And that was a very common name for a sorceress or a vova back in those days.
Don't you have a sorceress name?
I do. Yep, exactly. Another name that was very common for sorceresses was Groa, but Heid was probably the most common name.
I think Groa was the one in Svip.
Yes, his mother.
Skygard. Yeah, his mother.
His mother, exactly. So this name, Heid, which means bright one, it kind of links this sorceress with gold and with fire, because we don't, the translation is bright one, but there's many connotations to that. So they say that she charmed people with spells and worked magic, and that she was the favorite of evil wives. So we don't know exactly what they mean by evil wives, but it could just mean magical wives. Maybe the evil word was inserted later. But it does say that she was the favorite of women, and probably women who performed magic. And so we wonder, is this woman Freya? the mistress of Cider? That's really a big question. And right after this encounter, the war between the Vanir and the Aesir is mentioned. There's also some question whether Freya was the same as the goddess Frigg. There's some poems where Freya is portrayed as Odin's mistress, but she's also portrayed as the wife of a mysterious man named Od, and that is the same as Odin. Those names are the same. And Od is often away from her, and she searches the world, weeping tears of gold.
There's that gold again.
Yeah, exactly. So these are all, mysterious little linkages that I'm sure in the Viking age, they knew what all this meant. Mm-hmm. But Freya and Frigg may have been originally the same goddess and later split in two. But in the pantheon, Freya is from the Vanir and Frigg is an Aesir goddess. So we don't really know, but Frigg is the goddess of love and marriage. Freya is the goddess of love, but not marriage. Frigg has her own hall called Fensalir, and she is Odin's wife and the mother of Balder. In the Lokasenna, Freya warns Loki that Frigg knows the fate of everyone, but she doesn't speak of it. There's a lot more to Voluspa, the prophecy of the vulva, that you know all about.
Yes. Actually, before we get to that, I had a question about the Fylgja.
Oh.
I know this is kind of backtracking away. So does the Fylgja, is it the kind of animal does it represent that person's personality?
Yes.
Or their status in society? Like, would a warrior maybe have a Fylgja who was a wolf or a bear or something like that, whereas somebody else might have a different kind of Fylgja?
Yes, definitely. There's a hero named Bjarki who is in Rolf's saga Kraki, I believe, and he's fighting as in bear form. Mm-hmm. They show him laying in his tent as if he's asleep, and there's this enormous bear who's fighting in the battle. And while he's fighting, they're winning the battle. And then someone comes in and wakes Bjarki up and tells him, hey, you got to get out there and join the battle. And the bear disappears and they lose the battle.
Wow. Okay.
So, yeah.
I'd forgotten about Bjarki. Yeah.
That's probably one of the most common ones. But then Egil Skallagrim's father was named Velduls, which means evening wolf.
That's
and
right.
He supposedly turned into like a werewolf at certain times.
Sundown. Mm-hmm.
Yep. And they always say that after they've been in their Fylgja or their spirit animal, after they've come back out, they're exhausted, they're very weak. So they have supernatural powers while they're in there animating their Fylgja, but it takes a great deal of strength and energy for them to do that. And so when they come out, then they're just very weak and they're very vulnerable at that point.
Mm-hmm. And I just forgot what I was going to say. Oh, about Egil's father, about him turning into like a wolf at sundown. I remember when I first read that saga, and it's been a while, I remember thinking about sundowners. Anybody who has an aging parent who maybe has a little dementia or something, or a grandparent, or whatever, that happens. They get sundowners where they get a little aggressive or agitated around sundown. That's when they would, if they have issues, they might try to run away from wherever they're living. And I for some reason, I was equating Egil's father's wolf, his turning into a wolf at sundown, with sundowners. Like maybe he was just getting so mean at sundown that they were calling him a wolf.
Well, and I believe there's a couple of passages where he is just being grumpy. He doesn't actually turn into a wolf, but he his personality changes. And so that's exactly, I'm sure that's where the idea came from.
Maybe, even though they didn't live all that long. So maybe they weren't.
Most of them didn't.
Egil lived a pretty long time.
And Harold Finehair, he lived to be at least in his 70s. So there were people who did live to be old.
Yeah.
But they were much more rare.
Right. Okay, now we can go back to Voluspa.
Okay.
I just had that question. I jotted it down so I wouldn't forget. So this is a poem in the Poetic Edda, and it literally means the prophecy of the vulva. And it's probably one of the most well-known poems in the Poetic Edda. And it was most likely written down around the 900. I mean, known in the 900s, written down in the 1200s. And in this poem, a Volva, who is a seeress, is summoned by Odin. So he wants her to tell him about all the deeds of gods and men. And at the beginning, the way she describes herself, it seems as if she's a very ancient woman, whatever she is. In one stanza, she even says she remembers the seed of Yggdrasil, the world tree. So how old is she if she remembers that? And then she also says that the Jotun raised her. I read one translation where it said raised her and one it said reared her. So maybe is she a Jotun or was she something else? And she was just raised by them. It's not clear.
Good question.
Like a lot of things, it's not clear. What is clear to me is that she's really old, or she's either not human, or because she speaks of how humans were created, or she just knows everything from every part of time. Maybe her particular magic is she can go back to when Yggdrasil was a seed and she knows how humans were created. Either that or she actually does remember those things. Unclear. She's magic. And she tells Odin the story of Norse creation, which I'm not going to get into. It's pretty well known and it's fairly long. But while she's telling him that, she goes into a little side story about the dwarves and how they were created. And in this, she gives Odin a list of names for the dwarves. And this, to mention Tolkien again, this is where Tolkien got his names for his dwarves. He lifted it right out of Völuspá. We have Kili, Fili, Oakenshield, Thorin, Bomber. There's a bunch more. And it's also where the name Gandalf comes from. He was one of the dwarves in Norse mythology. And Gandalf's name literally means wand elf or staff elf, something like that. The Alf means elf and the Gandard means some kind of a staff or wand, which we will talk about in our next episode when we talk about the human seeresses, because they often had a staff.
Exactly.
Yes.
Also, there were a couple of kings who were also named Gandalf.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes. They're mentioned briefly. They're just saying where they're from. It's at least one.
Oh, nice. And in our previous episode, Johanna and I discussed that there are certain numbers that are important in mythology, and we've talked about 3 and 9. Of course, 9 is very important in Norse mythology, and the number 3 shows up a lot in this poem as well. So when the world is first created, the gods live on this plain, Idaval, and it's gold and it's beautiful, and it's a beautiful valley, and it's almost like they're kind of just galloping around in this field playing, and it's all lovely. And then 3 Jotun women show up. And then later in the creation story, 3 gods create the first human men and women. And then, of course, there are the 3 Norn. The Volva in Völuspá talks about the Nornir. And she also talks about the Valkyries and gives us a list of a few Valkyrie names. She speaks of Baldur's death, which we're also not going to get into because that leads into Ragnarok, which is the Norse end of the world scenario, the doom of the gods, the twilight of the gods. It's known as many things. And a big chunk of Völuspá is the Volva telling Odin about what's going to happen in Ragnarok. She foretells all the different signs that will come, what's going to happen to the gods, what's going to happen to men. And she lists all of this in great detail. She even tells Odin how he's going to die by the wolf Fenrir, who they so unceremoniously tied up in their shackles by tricking him. So, and Johanna had talked about Fenrir as one of Loki's children.
Yes. He had 3 children, the world serpent, the queen of Hel, whose name is Hel, and Fenrir. Those were the 3 children that Loki had with his Jotun wife.
Yes, as you had said, Loki is not a god. He is Jotun.
Yep. And he has a Jotun wife as well as an Æsir wife.
Yes.
And children by both of them, both of which we've mentioned in previous episodes.
And there are a couple of times throughout the poem where the Volva stops and she asks Odin if he's learned enough yet before she continues. And I think it's really interesting. Maybe it's 3 times. It's probably 3 times that she stops. And she basically says, have you heard enough yet, Odin? Have you learned enough? before she'll go on. And I don't know if she's just, giving him an out. Like, this is pretty heavy stuff that we're going to learn about. We're going to learn about how all these people die. You're going to find out how you die. You're going to find out how Thor dies. All of these people. I just realized, do we even know how any of the goddesses die?
Well, Freya survives, supposedly. Okay. And she enters the new world. But yeah, they don't talk about Frigg or any of the goddesses, or I guess the Jotuns actually win this battle.
Yeah.
Because they're on the other side. And so maybe Skadi and Gerd and some of the other Jotun women, maybe they survive it.
Maybe.
Doesn't really tell. But they do talk about there being a new world after.
Right.
But some people think that's Christianity, the coming of Christianity, or they equate it with that. However, Voluspa is a much older story. So, that may have been a gloss that was put on it later.
It could be. Except for the very last stanza, which I think is very Norse, because she leaves Odin with some really ominous words. So after the world is destroyed, it's created again and everything's kind of lovely. But in the very last stanza, she tells him how a dragon, the Nidhogg, will carry corpses on his wings as he flies over this new world. And then she just says, okay, I'm done. And then she
sinks back into the earth.
Yes. And it's like, wow, is that really how you're going to end it? That was dark. But to me, that is not the Christian influence. To me, that is the old part where she's like, I'm going to remind you that evil never goes away. No matter how lovely your new world is, there's still going to be evil in the form of this dragon. So yeah, to me, that's very Norse. In exchange for her wisdom, Odin paid her in rings and necklaces. So she at least got something out of it.
And we'll see in the next episode that payment to the vulvas was a very common thing. It was expected.
Yes. And it's good to know that at least Odin did that. At least he respected the convention. Exactly. And we will also see in the next episode other people awakening a vulva to ask her questions. So yes, and that will be in our next one when we talk about these vulvas, sorceresses, who are in the human world. They aren't supernatural beings. These are human women who perform magic. And that should be fun. And I know you know a lot about it. You've been studying it.
Well, there's all kinds of graves that they've discovered, but we'll go into that in the next one.
Yes, we'll have some good stories and some grave discoveries. There's a double meaning to grave discoveries.
Very good.
Is there anything else? Anything? No?
I think we covered it. I know there's a lot more, but we could go on and on for hours.
Yes. And give everybody a little break to absorb all of that. Yes. All right. Well, thank you. And I guess I'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. You can find Johanna at johannawittenberg.com, where you'll find a free short story, a prequel to her Norse Queen series. And you can find me, K.S., at ksbarton.com, where you can also find a free short story from me, a prequel to my Norse family series. See you next time.